Mrs. Dalloway. Novel by Virginia Woolf. Clarissa Dalloway, an upper-class, 52-year-old woman married to a politician, decides to buy flowers herself for the party she is hosting that evening instead of sending a servant to buy them. London is bustling and full of noise this Wednesday, almost 5 years after Armistice Day. Big Ben strikes. The King and Queen are at the palace. It is a fresh mid-June morning, and Clarissa recalls one girlhood summer on her father's estate, Brontë. She sees herself at 18, standing at the window, feeling as if something awful might happen. Despite the dangers, and despite having only a few twigs of knowledge passed on to her by her childhood governess, Clarissa loves life. Her one gift, she feels, is an ability to know people by instinct. Clarissa next runs into her old friend Hugh Whitbread. Hugh and Clarissa exchange a few words about Hugh's wife, Evelyn, who suffers from an unspecified internal ailment. Beside the proper and admirable Hugh, Clarissa feels self-conscious about her hat. Past and present continue to intermingle as she walks to the flower shop. She remembers how her old friend Peter Walsh disapproved of Hugh. She thinks affectionately of Peter, who once asked her to marry him. She refused. He made her cry when he said she would marry a prime minister and throw parties. Clarissa continues to feel the sting of his criticisms, but now also feels anger that Peter did not accomplish any of his dreams. She continues to walk and considers the idea of death. She believes she will survive in the perpetual motion of the modern London streets, in the lives of her friends and even strangers, in the trees, in her home. She reads lines about death from a book in a shop window. Clarissa reflects that she does not do things for themselves, but in order to affect other people's opinions of her. She imagines having her life to live over again. She regrets her face, beaked like a bird's, and her thin body. She stops to look at a Dutch picture, and feels invisible. She is conscious that the world sees her as her husband's wife, as Mrs. Richard Dalloway. Clarissa looks in the window of a glove shop and contemplates her daughter, Elizabeth, who cares little for fashion and prefers to spend time with her dog or her history teacher, Miss Kilman, with whom she reads prayer books and attends communion. Clarissa wonders if Elizabeth is falling in love with Miss Kilman, but Richard believes it is just a phase. Clarissa thinks of her hatred for Miss Kilman, which she is aware is irrational, as a monster. A car backfires while Clarissa is in the flower shop, and she and several others turn to observe the illustrious person passing in a grand car. They wonder if it is the Queen or the Prime Minister behind the blinds. The car inspires feelings of patriotism in many onlookers. Septimus Warren Smith, a veteran of World War I, who is about 30 years old, also hears the car backfire. He suffers from shell shock, a mental illness brought on by the horrors of war, and believes he is responsible for the traffic congestion the passing car causes. Rezia, or Rezia, his young Italian wife, is embarrassed by his odd manner and also frightened, since Septimus recently threatened to kill himself. She leads him to Regent's Park, where they sit together. Septimus's thoughts are incomprehensible to his wife. He believes he is connected to trees, and that trees must not be cut down. He believes that if he looks beyond the park railings he will see his dead friend, Evans, and fears the world might burst into flames. Septimus, Rezia, and many minor characters observe a plane overhead writing letters in the sky. The letters eventually seem to read toffee. Septimus believes someone is trying to communicate with him in a coded language. Rezia cannot stand to see him so broken, staring and talking out loud, and she walks to the fountain. She sees a statue of an Indian holding a cross. She feels alone and for a moment is angry with Septimus. After all, Dr. Holmes has said that Septimus has nothing at all the matter with him. Suddenly, Rezia feels her devotion to her husband clearly and returns to where he sits. A young woman, Maisie Johnson, asks them directions, and as she walks away, she thinks about how strange the couple is. An older woman, Carrie Dempster, observes Maisie and feels regret about her own life. Clarissa enters her home, feeling like a nun who has left the world and now returns to the familiar rituals of a convent. Although she does not believe in God, the moment is precious to her, like a bud on the tree of life. She is upset to learn that Richard has been invited to lunch at Lady Bruton's house without her. Ascending to her attic bedroom, Clarissa continues to reflect on her own mortality. As Clarissa takes off her yellow feathered hat, she feels an emptiness at the heart of her life. She has slept alone since she was ill with influenza, but is happy to be solitary. She does not feel passionate about Richard and believes she has failed him in this regard. She feels sexual attraction to women and thinks she was in love with her friend Sally Seton, who spent a summer at Brontë. Sally Seton, in Clarissa's memory, was a wild, cigarette-smoking, dark-haired rebel. Once Sally ran naked through the hallway at Brontë. Her behavior frequently shocked Clarissa's old Aunt Helena. Clarissa and Sally planned to change the world. Under Sally's influence, Clarissa began to read Plato in bed before breakfast and to read Shelley for hours. Clarissa remembers going downstairs in a white dress to meet Sally, thinking of a line from Shakespeare's play Othello, "If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy." Like Othello, she believes that if she were to die at that moment, she would be quite happy. Othello kills his wife, Desdemona, out of jealousy, then kills himself when he finds out his jealousy is unwarranted. The most exquisite moment of Clarissa's life occurred on the terrace at Brontë when, one evening, Sally picked a flower and kissed her on the lips. For Clarissa, the kiss was a religious experience. Peter Walsh interrupted the young women on the terrace, as thoughts of him now interrupt Clarissa's recollection of Sally. Clarissa always wanted Peter's good opinion, and she wonders what he will think of her now. The house buzzes with pre-party activity, and Clarissa begins to mend the green dress she will wear that night. She shows an interest in her servants and is sensitive to their workload. She wants to be generous and is grateful to her servants for allowing her to be so. She sits quietly with her sewing, thinking of life as a wave that begins, collects, and falls, only to renew and begin again. The front doorbell rings, and Peter Walsh surprises Clarissa with an unexpected visit. Peter plays with his pocketknife, as he always did, and feels irritated with Clarissa for the kind of life she's chosen to live with conservative Richard. Seeing that she's been mending a dress, he assumes she has simply been wasting time with parties and society since he left for India, shortly after Clarissa rejected his marriage proposal. He says he is in town to arrange a divorce for his young fiancée, Daisy, who lives in India and has 2 children. He imagines the Dalloways consider him a failure. Clarissa feels like a frivolous chatterbox around Peter. Moved by his memories and made sensitive by the sheer struggle of living, Peter bursts into tears. To comfort him, Clarissa takes his hand and kisses him. She wonders briefly to herself whether she would have been happier if she had married Peter instead of Richard. Peter asks Clarissa if she is happy, but Elizabeth enters the room before she can answer. As Peter leaves, Clarissa calls after him, "Remember my party tonight." We share Peter's point of view as he leaves Clarissa's house. Peter believes Clarissa has grown hard and sentimental. He criticizes her harshly to himself, thinking unhappily that her girlhood timidity has become conventionality in middle age. Then he begins to worry that he annoyed her with his unexpected visit and is embarrassed for having wept in her presence. One moment Peter feels thrilled that he is in love with Daisy and has a life in India about which Clarissa knows nothing, while the next moment he feels anew the blow of Clarissa having rejected him 30 years before. The sound of St. Margaret's bell sounding the half-hour makes him think of Clarissa's death, which upsets him, as does the thought of growing old himself. Though he will eventually have to ask Richard's help in finding a job, Peter tells himself he does not care a straw what the Dalloways think of him. He admits he has been a failure in some sense, as when he was expelled from Oxford, but he feels the future lies in the hands of young men such as he was. A group of military boys march by, and Peter feels respect for them. In the middle of Trafalgar Square, Peter feels suddenly free. Nobody except Clarissa knows he is in London. He begins to follow a young woman, who seems to become his ideal woman as he looks at her. He compares her to Clarissa, and decides that she is not rich or worldly, as Clarissa is. He wonders if she is respectable. Peter feels like a romantic buccaneer and is impressed by his own adventurousness. The woman takes out her keys and enters her house, never having spoken to Peter, which does not trouble him very much. He thinks of Clarissa telling him to remember her party that night. Peter decides to sit in Regent's Park and smoke before his appointment with the lawyers, with whom he will arrange Daisy's divorce. He observes London and is proud of its level of civilization. He remembers how he was unable to get along with Clarissa's father. Having chosen a seat beside an elderly gray-haired nurse with a baby asleep in its stroller, Peter remembers Elizabeth. He expects that Elizabeth does not get along with Clarissa, as he feels Clarissa has a tendency to overdo things, which might embarrass Elizabeth. Soon Peter falls asleep. He dreams about a solitary traveler who conceives of different images of women. The traveler, who seems to be Peter himself, imagines a woman made of sky and branches who bestows compassion and absolution. He imagines this woman as a siren, someone who might lure him to his death with her beauty. Finally, he imagines a mother figure who seems to wait for his return. When the image of the woman, now a landlady, asks if she can get the solitary traveler anything else at the end of the dream, he realizes he does not know to whom he can reply. Peter wakes up saying the death of the soul, and he links the dream and those words to a scene from Brontë in the early 1890s. That summer, Clarissa is shocked to hear about a neighbor who had a baby before she was married. Clarissa's prudish reaction makes Peter feel that the moment marks the death of her soul. Her reaction seemed not only prudish but also arrogant, judgmental, and unimaginative, and others who were at the table at the time were uncomfortable with her blatant scorn of and lack of sympathy for the woman. Richard Dalloway comes to Brontë for dinner that night, and Peter knows immediately that Clarissa will marry Richard, toward whom she seems maternal. Peter finally decides to confront her about his own feelings. They meet by a broken fountain that dribbles water, and Peter demands the truth. Clarissa tells him it is no use, that she will not marry him. Peter leaves Brontë that night. Peter watches a child in Regent's Park run into Rezia's legs. Rezia helps the child to stand up and thinks that she cannot tolerate Septimus's disturbing behavior anymore. Septimus says people are wicked. Once, by the river, he even suggested that he and Rezia kill themselves. He feels he knows the meaning of the world. A dog seems to become a man in front of his eyes. Rezia wishes she were back in Milan, making hats with her sisters. She tells Septimus it is time to go for his doctor's appointment. Septimus believes his dead friend, Evans, is walking toward them in the park, but the man approaching is actually Peter Walsh. To Peter, the Smiths are simply a young couple having a lover's quarrel. Peter marvels over the changes that have taken place in London since he was there 5 years ago, in 1918. Women are dressed well, and he likes their new habit of wearing makeup. He is impressed by the open-minded tone of newspapers and by the new sexually liberated generation. Peter remembers Sally Seton flaring up at Hugh Whitbread in Brontë for his conservative views on women's rights. Sally told Hugh he represented all that was detestable about the British middle class. Peter loathes Hugh and his pretentiousness, but also envies Hugh's success. He finds Richard Dalloway a dull, but good man. Richard once said nobody should read Shakespeare's sonnets, because doing so was like listening at a keyhole. Constantly returning to thoughts of Clarissa, Peter tells himself he is not in love with her anymore and reflects on her worldliness and her love of rank and tradition. Peter laments Clarissa's marriage, which forces her to quote Richard constantly, thus withholding her own thoughts. Peter feels that she has a genius for making her home a meeting place for young people and artists. He wonders if she gains insight from the philosophers she read as a girl, Huxley and Tyndall. When Clarissa was young, she saw a falling tree kill her sister, Sylvia. She did not become bitter, however, and continues to enjoy nearly everything. Peter wonders if he is truly in love with Daisy, since he is not tortured over his relationship with her in the way he was with Clarissa. He is aware that he wants to marry her mainly because he doesn't want her to marry anyone else. Peter hears someone opposite the Regent's Park tube station singing a song about love and death. The voice comes from a decrepit old woman who at first seems sexless. She sings the line, "And if someone should see, what matter they?" Peter feels sorry for her and gives her a coin. The point of view shifts to Rezia, who is also in the park. Initially, Rezia shares Peter's pity for the old woman, but the more Rezia listens, the more the song comforts her. She becomes hopeful that the psychiatrist Sir William Bradshaw will cure Septimus. The point of view changes again, becoming closer to that of a traditional omniscient third-person narrator. We see Septimus and Rezia crossing the street and learn something of Septimus's past. Before the war, he was an aspiring poet and fell in love with Miss Isabel Pole, who gave lectures on Shakespeare. The point of view changes for a brief time to that of Mr. Brewer, Septimus's boss at the time at Sibley's and Arrowsmith, auctioneers, valuers, land and estate agents in London. Mr. Brewer thought Septimus had potential and, noticing that Septimus looked weak and unhealthy, recommended he play football. When Septimus went to fight in World War I, he became inseparable from his officer, Evans. Evans died, however, and Septimus felt nothing. Scared by his own lack of emotion, he married a young Italian woman, Lucrezia, when he was billeted in Milan. Septimus begins to see ugliness in everything. Rezia wishes to have children, but Septimus does not want to bring children into the world or perpetuate the suffering he endures. His illness grows more severe, and Dr. Holmes comes to treat him. Holmes says Septimus is in a funk and that a trip to the music hall and a healthy diet should solve the problem. He feels the trouble is Septimus's nerves. Septimus sees Holmes as the embodiment of human nature, which has condemned him to death for his inability to feel. Finally, Holmes suggests that if the Smiths have no confidence in him, they should visit a specialist named Sir William Bradshaw. As Big Ben strikes noon, Clarissa lays her green dress on her bed and the Smiths walk down Harley Street to Septimus's appointment with the celebrated psychiatrist Sir William Bradshaw. Known for his tact and understanding, Sir William is gray-haired and has an expensive gray car. He ascertains that Septimus is in a state of complete physical and nervous breakdown within 2 or 3 minutes of meeting him. When Sir William asks Septimus if he served with distinction in the war, Septimus thinks of the war as a little shindy of schoolboys with gunpowder. Septimus tries to explain to the doctor that he has committed a terrible crime. Rezia protests that it is untrue, and the doctor takes her aside. When Rezia admits that Septimus has threatened to commit suicide, Sir William prescribes a long period of bed rest in one of his homes in the country. Septimus will have to be separated from Rezia, though. Sir William prefers not to speak of madness, but rather of a lack of proportion. The son of a tradesman, Sir William never had time to read. He resents Septimus's shabbiness, as well as his cultivation. Sir William tells Septimus that everybody has moments of depression and that nobody lives for himself alone. He reminds Septimus that he has a brilliant career ahead of him. Septimus feels he is being tortured by human nature in the form of Dr. Holmes and Sir William. He tries again to confess his crime, but he cannot remember what it is. He stammers out the pronoun I, and Sir William tells him not to think about himself. Sir William is eager to end the consultation and says he will let them know about the arrangements between 5 and 6 that evening. Rezia thinks Sir William has failed them and that he is not a nice man. Sir William's philosophy of proportion involves prescribing weight gain and solitary rest. He secludes the mentally ill and forbids that they have children. His patients must conform to his sense of proportion, or he considers them mad. The narrator critiques Sir William's theories. Conversion, or pressure to conform to social norms, masquerades as brotherly love, but in colonies like India and at home in London, conversion is actually a quest for power. Sir William is in the business of colonizing people's minds. Lady Bradshaw lost touch with herself 15 years ago, when her will succumbed to her husband's. Now she takes pictures of decaying churches and occupies herself with various causes. Patients occasionally ask Sir William if the matter of living or not living is a personal choice. Though he shrugs his shoulders when asked if God exists, Sir William adamantly believes that no choice exists between life and death. He champions the prospects of brilliant careers, courage, and family affection. If a patient's unsocial impulses are out of control, he sends them away to a home. Sir William is greedy for dominion and impresses his will on the weak. Hugh Whitbread examines the shoes and socks in a shop window on Oxford Street before he lunches at Lady Burton's with Richard Dalloway. Hugh is not a deep person, but he is very courteous in an old-fashioned way and always brings Lady Burton a bunch of carnations when he visits. Lady Burton's assistant, Millie Brush, cannot stand Hugh, but he is oblivious to her disdain. Lady Burton, at 62, prefers Richard to Hugh, but she feels Hugh is kind. She does not see the point of cutting people up, the way Clarissa does. Lady Burton announces to her two guests that she wants their help, but says they will discuss business after they eat. A magnificent lunch appears like magic, served by discreet, white-capped maids. Nobody seems to have paid for the food, and the table seems to have set itself. Richard thinks Lady Burton, the descendant of a great general, should have been a general herself. She has a reputation for talking like a man. Richard has great respect for her and enjoys the notion of a well-set-up woman from a great family. Lady Burton is anxious to talk to the men about her business, but decides to wait until after they drink their coffee. Lady Burton asks after Clarissa, who thinks Lady Burton does not like her. Hugh brags that he met Clarissa that morning. Lady Burton tells them that Peter Walsh is in town. They all remember how passionately in love with Clarissa Peter once was, as well as how he went to India and made a mess of things. Richard decides to go home after lunch and tell Clarissa he loves her. Millie Brush watches Richard and feels she might once have fallen in love with him. Lady Burton, Richard, and Hugh all like Peter, but feel helping him is impossible because of his flawed character. Emigration to Canada is Lady Burton's cause. Her letter-writing skills are poor, and she is unable to write to the Times about the issue. She has invited Hugh and Richard to lunch so they can help her. She thinks Hugh knows how to write a letter that appeals to editors. Richard finds Hugh's letter to be nonsense, but Lady Burton is thrilled with it. She stuffs Hugh's carnations into the front of her dress and calls him M.Y. Prime Minister. Richard plans to write a history of Lady Burton's family, and she tells him the papers are all in order for when the time comes, by which she means when the Labour Party comes into power. Richard reminds Lady Burton about Clarissa's party. The men leave and Lady Burton lies on the sofa. She remembers herself as a girl, riding on her pony in the country and roughhousing with her brothers. Hugh and Richard seem attached to her by a thread, which grows thinner as they move farther from her. Hugh and Richard look lazily into an antique shop window. Hugh considers buying a Spanish necklace for his wife, Evelyn. Richard, looking at the things in the shop, is struck by the emptiness of life. Richard starts home toward Clarissa and wants to bring her something. He decides to buy a vast bouquet of red and white roses. He feels his life and marriage to Clarissa are miracles after the war. Richard thinks about social reforms when he passes a woman stretched on the ground. She is free of all ties, and laughs at the sight of him when he passes, holding his bouquet like a weapon. He considers the problem of the female vagrant. He feels Clarissa wants his support. At home, Clarissa is irritated because her frumpy cousin, Ellie Henderson, is coming to the party, and because Elizabeth is praying with Miss Kilman. Richard enters, but he is unable to tell Clarissa he loves her. They talk, and he holds her hand. Richard leaves for a meeting and sets Clarissa up for a rest on the sofa. Clarissa feels unhappy because Peter and Richard criticize her for liking parties. She decides she throws parties simply because she loves life. Her parties are an offering. Elizabeth enters the room where her mother rests, while Miss Kilman waits outside on the landing, wearing an unflattering mackintosh coat. She is poor and feels Clarissa is foolish and condescending. Miss Kilman thinks she has been cheated out of happiness. She was a victim of anti-German discrimination during the war, due to her German ancestry and to the sympathetic attitude she displays toward the Germans, and the school where she taught fired her. She became religious 2 years and 3 months ago. Now she feels she does not envy women like Clarissa, but merely pities them. When Clarissa gets up to greet Miss Kilman wishes to fell her like a tree. She wants to make Clarissa cry. Clarissa is shocked by the hateful look in Miss Kilman's eyes and feels Miss Kilman has stolen Elizabeth from her. After a moment, Miss Kilman's threat seems to shrink for Clarissa, and Clarissa laughs and says goodbye. She calls out to remember her party. When they are gone, Clarissa thinks that love and religion are the cruelest things in the world. Clarissa watches an old woman in the house opposite hers climb the stairs and look out the window, unaware that anybody watches. Clarissa often watches her do this and feels it means something good, which she thinks is the possibility of true privacy. She does not think Miss Kilman's religion or Peter Walsh's being in love solves the mystery of the human soul. She has her room and the old woman has hers. Miss Kilman thinks Clarissa laughed at her for her ugliness. She struggles to control her desire to resemble Clarissa and prays to God. All she lives for, besides Elizabeth, is food, tea, and a hot water bottle at night. Miss Kilman thinks it is unjust that she must suffer while Clarissa has no hardships. At the Army and Navy stores, Miss Kilman buys a petticoat. Elizabeth guides her around like an unwieldy battleship. They have tea and Miss Kilman eats greedily, feeling resentment when a child next to them eats a pink cake she had her eye on. Miss Kilman tells Elizabeth that all professions are open to women of her generation and makes her consider the plight of the poor. Elizabeth regrets that Clarissa and Miss Kilman do not get along, though she is aware that Clarissa makes an effort. When Clarissa offered Miss Kilman flowers sent from Brontë, Miss Kilman squashed them in a bunch. Miss Kilman's self-pity becomes overwhelming, and Elizabeth longs to leave her. Miss Kilman is desperate to keep Elizabeth at the table with her, but eventually Elizabeth leaves. Miss Kilman goes to Westminster Abbey and prays. Meanwhile, Elizabeth gets on an omnibus to the Strand and rides through a busy working-class neighborhood that her family never visits. People have begun to notice Elizabeth's beauty, and she is obliged to go to parties. She would rather be in the country with her father and the dogs. She considers what she might do for a career, such as become a doctor or a farmer or go into Parliament. She is lazy and feels these ideas are silly, so she will say nothing about it. Elizabeth knows Clarissa will want her at home, so she boards another bus and returns home. Septimus watches sunlight play on the wallpaper from the couch. He thinks of the line from the Shakespeare play Cymbeline, "Fear no more." Rezia sees him smile, but is disturbed. Often he speaks nonsense or has visions, believing himself drowned or falling into flames. She feels that they no longer have a marriage. Rezia makes a hat for Mrs. Peters, the married daughter of their neighbor Mrs. Filmer. Rezia talks, and Septimus begins to look around him. He says the hat is too small for Mrs. Peters and speaks in a lucid way for the first time in weeks. He and Rezia joke together, and Rezia is relieved that they're acting like a married couple. Septimus, who has a good eye for color, begins designing the hat. When he is finished, Rezia stitches it together. Septimus feels he is in a warm place, such as on the edge of the woods. He is proud of his work on Mrs. Peter's hat. In the future, Rezia will always like that hat, which they made when Septimus was himself. Rezia worries when she hears a tap at the door. She thinks it might be Sir William, but it is only the young girl who brings them the evening paper. Rezia kisses the child, gets out a bag of sweets, and dances around the room with her. Rezia builds the moment up until it is something wonderful. Septimus reads the paper and grows tired. He feels happy. As he begins to fall asleep, the laughing voices begin to sound like cries. Septimus wakes up terrified. Rezia has gone to bring the child back to her mother. Septimus feels he is doomed to be alone. Around him, he sees only ordinary objects, like the coal shuttle and bananas on the sideboard. He no longer sees the beauty of the afternoon. He calls out for Evans, but receives no answer. Rezia returns and begins making an adjustment to Mrs. Peter's hat. Rezia feels she can now speak openly with Septimus. She remembers the first time she saw him, when he looked like a young hawk. The time for Sir William's message to arrive is nearing. Septimus asks why Sir William has the right to tell him what he must do. Rezia says it is because he threatened to kill himself. Septimus asks for the papers on which he and Rezia wrote down his theories about beauty and death, and tells Rezia to burn them all. However, Rezia thinks some of what he wrote is very beautiful, and she ties the papers in a piece of silk and puts them away. Rezia says she will go wherever Septimus goes. Septimus thinks she is a flowering tree and that she fears no one. He thinks she is a miracle. Rezia goes to pack their things. She hears voices downstairs and worries that Dr. Holmes is calling. She runs down to prevent the doctor from coming upstairs. Septimus quickly considers killing himself by various methods and decides he must throw himself from the window. He does not want to die and thinks this is the doctor's idea of tragedy, not his or Rezia's. He thinks life was good. An old man on a staircase across the way stares at him. Septimus hears Holmes at the door. He cries, "I'll give it you," and flings himself out the window onto Mrs. Filmer's railings. Holmes sees what Septimus has done and calls him a coward. Rezia understands what Septimus has done. Holmes gives her a glass of sweet liquid that makes her sleepy. Holmes does not think Rezia should see Septimus when paramedics carry him away, since his body is so mangled. Before falling asleep, Rezia sees the outline of Holmes's body against the window. She thinks, so that was Dr. Holmes. Standing across from the British Museum, Peter Walsh hears the ambulance rush to pick up Septimus's body. He views the ambulance as one of the triumphs of civilization. The English health system strikes him as humane, and London's community spirit impresses him. As he walks toward his hotel, he thinks of Clarissa. They used to explore London together by riding the omnibus. Clarissa had a theory that to know somebody, one had to seek out the people and places that completed that person. She felt that people spread far beyond their own selves and might even survive in this way after death. Clarissa has influenced Peter more than anybody else he knows. Peter arrives at his hotel and thinks about Clarissa at Brontë. They used to walk in the woods, argue, and discuss poetry, people, and politics. Clarissa was a radical in those days. At the hotel, Peter receives a letter from Clarissa that says it was heavenly to see him that morning. He is upset by the letter, which seems like a nudge in the ribs after his vivid memories of Clarissa. The hotel now strikes Peter as frigid and impersonal. He imagines Clarissa regretting her refusal of his marriage proposal and then feeling sorry for him. He pictures her weeping as she wrote him the note. Peter looks at a snapshot of Daisy with a fox terrier on her knee. She is dark and very pretty. Peter shaves and dresses for dinner. He wonders whether his marriage to Daisy would be good for her, as it would mean giving up her children and being judged by society. He is conflicted about Daisy. He does not like the idea of being faithful to her, but he hates the idea of Daisy being with anyone else. He quickly disregards the age difference between them and takes comfort in knowing she adores him. He decides that if he retires, he will write books. At dinner, the other hotel guests find him appealing. His self-composure and serious approach to eating his dinner win him their respect. They like the way he orders Bartlett pears firmly. The guests wish to talk with one another, but they feel shy. In the smoking room, Peter and the Morris family make small talk. Peter thinks they like him. He decides to go to Clarissa's party to find out what the Conservatives are doing in India and to hear the gossip. Peter sits in a wicker chair on the hotel steps. The night is hot but lighter than he is used to, because daylight savings has been introduced since he was last in London. He reads the paper and watches young people pass by on their way to the movies. He thinks the social structure is changing and that experience enriches life. He sets off for Clarissa's and feels that he is about to have an experience. He looks in people's lighted windows on his way and enjoys the richness of life. At Clarissa's house, Peter steels himself, opens the blade of his pocket knife, and enters the party. The Dalloway servants rush around and make last-minute party preparations. The Prime Minister is supposed to arrive, but this does not make any difference to the cook, Mrs. Walker, who is overwhelmed with work. Dinner over, the female guests go upstairs and the men call to the kitchen for the imperial Tokay, a sweet wine. Elizabeth worries about her dog and tells a servant to check on it. More people arrive and the men join the women upstairs. Clarissa says, "How delightful to see you," to everybody, which Peter finds insincere. He wishes he had stayed at home. Clarissa fears her party will be a failure. She is aware of Peter's critical eye, but thinks she would rather be drenched in fire while attempting her party than fade like her meek cousin, Ellie Henderson. The wind blows a curtain, and Clarissa sees a guest beat it back and go on talking. She thinks her party may be a success after all. Guests continue to arrive, but Clarissa does not enjoy herself. She feels anyone could take her role as hostess, but is also somewhat proud of her party's success. The hired butler, Mr. Wilkins, announces Lady Rossiter, who turns out to be Sally Seton, now married. Sally heard about the party through a mutual friend and has arrived unexpectedly. Clarissa remembers the moment in her youth when she was thrilled merely to think of being under the same roof with Sally. She thinks Sally has lost her luster, but they laugh and embrace and seem ecstatic to see one another. With her old bravado and egotism, Sally says she has 5 enormous boys. The Prime Minister arrives, interrupting Clarissa's reunion with Sally. He does his rounds and retires to a little room with Lady Bruton. Peter Walsh catches sight of Hugh Whitbread and criticizes him mercilessly in his thoughts. Meanwhile, he watches Clarissa in her silver-green mermaid's dress and feels she still has the power to sum up all of life in a moment, merely by passing by and catching her scarf in some woman's dress. Peter reminds himself that he is not in love with her anymore. Clarissa sees the Prime Minister off and thinks she does not feel passionate about seeing anyone. She prefers the intense hatred inspired by Miss Kilman, since the emotion is heartfelt. She returns to the party and mingles with her guests, all of whom seem to have failed in their lives in some regard. Mrs. Hilbery tells Clarissa she looks like her mother, and Clarissa is moved. Old Aunt Helena arrives and talks about orchids and Burma. Sally catches Clarissa by the arm, but Clarissa is busy and says she will come back later, meaning that she will talk to her old friends when the others have gone. Everyone's thoughts dip constantly into the past. Clarissa must speak to the Bradshaws. She dislikes Sir William, but tolerates Lady Bradshaw, who tells Clarissa about Septimus's suicide. Clarissa goes into the little room where the Prime Minister sat so she can be alone. She feels angry that the Bradshaws brought death to her party. She ruminates about Septimus's death and thinks he has preserved something that is obscured in her own life. She sees his death as an attempt at communication. She remembers the moment she felt she could die at Brontë in total happiness. She considers the young man's death her own disgrace. Clarissa looks out the window and sees the old woman in the house across the way going to bed. She hears the party behind her and thinks of the words from Shakespeare's play Cymbeline, "Fear no more the heat of the sun." She identifies with Septimus and feels glad he has thrown his life away. She returns to the party, where Peter and Sally are gossiping about the past and present and wondering where she is. Sally goes to say goodnight to Richard. Peter is filled with terror and ecstasy when Clarissa appears.